And I thought I'd end with this project because this is really the project that connected me to the Smithsonian. May refer to having grown up together in the Smithsonian. I have been very privileged that I have gone from being an outsider to being an insider at the Smithsonian, which happens a lot. It happens a lot in our country, and so I'm finishing up my third term as vice chairman of the national board and chair the National Latino Board of the Smithsonian. And what started that was the idea that why did everything that the Smithsonian do have to happen in Washington, D.C.? Why couldn't it happen in communities around the country? There are 140 or so million objects that belong in the collections of the Smithsonian, including thousands that reside in this building that will never be seen by Americans. And so out of a not so wonderful situation, I actually had the opportunity to host the secretary of the Smithsonian in San Antonio and talk to him about that idea. We spent the day in school rooms across my community and had a conversation about a generation of citizens of this country who would probably never be able to afford to go to Washington, D.C. to see a Smithsonian museum. And I took him to this place, which is called the Mercado. It's the marketplace in San Antonio. That has always been a place of interaction and dialogue amongst people from different backgrounds and cultural heritages. And talked to him about the construction of a museum in San Antonio that would begin to resolve that issue of Smithsonian outside of Washington, D.C. And so we gave him a beautiful dinner that night after this long conversation. It was the first time that the Daughters of the Republic of Texas allowed people to have a dinner within the walls of the Alamo. I say it's the second time that Mexicans pitched a tent at the Alamo and won, because he got up that evening and he announced that there would be a permanent physical presence of the Smithsonian in San Antonio. And what that turned into was a year-long design process with people just like yourselves, not just curators and conservators and bureaucrats, but people like yourselves, to decide what that meant. And what it turned into is what we call the Smithsonian Affiliations Project. There are now 135 affiliates across the country, museums, universities, cultural centers who can borrow objects and programs from the Smithsonian in their community. And San Antonio was the first, although it wasn't the first to open. And it will open in April of next year. And it was a very sensitive design project. There were 99 public hearings to decide the architecture of this building. Once again, it was a existing building that was going to be renovated. The building had already been added to, and so it had 2 arcades of arches that were not real. And we entered into a dialogue with about 20 of the most important, famous, and smart scholars, Latino scholars around the country. A gentleman by the name of Tomás Ibarra Frausto, who is the head of culture and creativity at the Rockefeller Foundation here in New York. Amalia Mesa Baines, who was the first Latino MacArthur Fellow in the country. And they decided that the building had to be a building of its time. So it's a building that is built in a historic place, the architecture of which is in some cases real and in some cases fantasy landscape, but that the building needed to be today and the future. So we decided that there were materials that were sold inside of Market Square, folkloric materials, in this case a molcajete, but that's what they bring guacamole out when you go to a Mexican restaurant. But this goes back to the Aztecs and to the Mayans. And in my family, Our molcajete has been passed down from my grandmother to my mother to my sister. And so we decided this is a piece of hojalata, that's that Mexican tin work I was telling you about, and you will see 4 different eras in this material. You'll see the pre-Columbian era in this relief right here, which is actually Quetzalcoatl. You will see the aura of the Virgen de Guadalupe and the way that the piece is carved away. You will see the eagle from the Chicano political movement. There's the head of the eagle from the Chicano political movement of the 1960s and 70s. And for those of you who got all of your briefing materials today, you'll see that when the panels come together, they form the sun of the Smithsonian. And that is the museum architecture. It is in many ways, the lobby is a lantern that shows the way to the future. The base of the building is that volcanic rock material that I showed you in the molcajete. We decided, what the hell, we're just going to do color. And so the building is painted the most incredible shade of what I call raspachismo pink. And when I was a little boy, there's a fountain that no longer exists in San Antonio, but on Sunday afternoons it was a big deal in my family to drive around this plaza and go watch this fountain change colors. So this is the $250,000 version of that little fountain. It is a building that has many intersections, and in itself is a contact zone. Not only is it the first formal affiliation of the Smithsonian, but it is also Governor Bush, when he was governor, declared it the official Latino museum of the state of Texas, so it has a very important place. It's the first Latino museum in Texas. When you look at Latino museums, there are so few in this country, and they have a tendency to be outside of the city center. So there's a wonderful museum here in New York, but it is very far off of, it's on Museum Mile, but it's way up Museum Mile. And the same is true of the museum in Chicago. And the same is true of the facilities in San Francisco. And so one kind of interesting difference about this is that there are 4 million visitors a year to Market Square. So when this museum opens, it will be the most visited museum of its kind in the country, but it will also be the most visited museum in San Antonio. So the most visited museum in San Antonio draws about 145,000 visitors a year, and this is projected to draw about 400,000 visitors a year. I wanted to tell you that architecture is not a closed process. The design of space, urban planning, should never be a process that is pure. If anybody had ever told me when I was a little boy that I would grow up to be involved in a business that would have the opportunity to change the way people's lives work, I could never have imagined. And even after 10 years of running what I thought was a business, I didn't understand that architecture was activism. It was communication and conversation. It almost always is politics, in particular when you've chosen to commit your life to public architecture. But the most important thing about the future, I think, of the most public art in the world is that people like yourselves give voice to it. And I hope that I've demonstrated that over the course now of almost 13 years of working to give voice to people who never had a voice in the built environment before, that in communities across America, people who are not trained designers can help change the landscape, and they can develop generations of young people who in the future will change the landscape of this country and other places around the world. I'm happy to answer questions.
And unfortunately, I can't stay to hear the answer, but I'll watch the tape. You talk about not being a trained architect, yet obviously you've been incredibly successful in this field. Can you talk a little bit, many of the teachers here, we all talk about guiding students to find their ways in ways that might be unexpected. How did you find yourself in this position without that kind of formal training?
A couple of different ways. My mom was a fashion person. So even when there wasn't a lot of money in our family, there was this place called Solo Serve. It was kind of like Loman's. And I remember always being intrigued with aesthetics. And the school that I went, the elementary school that I went to, had a really wonderful arts program. It's just that I wasn't raised in a family where, I was supposed to be a politician. And so I wasn't raised in a family where that part of myself was developed. And so I think that the most important thing was to have someone in my family who had that kind of aesthetic interest, and then to have it supported inside the school, not in an architectural manner, but in a manner that said the way that you express yourself is important. I was intimidated for years. It took me 6 months of doing that kind of photo documentation that I showed you earlier before I ever had the courage to go into the office and tell my partner that I had an idea for an architecture that I thought was important to the country. Fortunately, he's such a wonderful person, and he understood immediately that the idea was important, that he encouraged it. Encouragement is incredibly important. He could have said, you don't know what you're talking about, go back to managing the business, go sell architecture. I'm very good at selling architecture. But he said, no, I think you're right. And so I think encouragement and artistic expression, which we really seem to be losing, at least in my area, from the curriculums that are presenting themselves in our public schools, and quite honestly in the private schools, I think is incredibly important. That's why I think that this foundation, for example, in Ed Cal Chelsea, does such a wonderful job of pointing that out and of not just preserving it, but expressing it so that it's there. And once it's there, you'll find your way into it, I believe. Yes, ma'am.
I really enjoyed your lecture, and I really, I love your thinking and how you have like thinking spaces in all your buildings, and how you're able to bring opposites and disparities together. And we were also talking about politics yesterday, and how it's a bringing together of people, and you must be tremendously skilled to be able to bring to the table, consensus, because I imagine it would be very difficult to do in these kinds of projects. My question is about the cultural aesthetic, the combinations. When you were talking about color previously, about the evolution of color, I was wondering if you could elaborate or touch more on the significance of color in Tejano views.
It's very complex. I didn't know it was complex, but it's very complex. When I was growing up, I was very fortunate. I had this very disjointed upbringing because I was raised in a family of activists. So my father was a politician and a labor leader, right? And I remember being sent home once from school and not really understanding why I was being sent home from school. So I went to wonderful private schools, and I did not grow up in the barrio of San Antonio. I was sent home from school because we had picketed the Archbishop's residence the day before. I was only 7, I think, so I didn't remember it. And so I didn't understand these issues. And design sometimes doesn't teach you. What I found out was that I was taught to assimilate. The way to success is to assimilate. When I went to school, we were told not to speak Spanish. I grew up not speaking Spanish. I had to be taught how to speak Spanish. And so assimilation is a very important concept. And so, for example, the school that I showed you in La Jolla, Texas, with those very brightly painted colors, the first time the colors started going up, one of the school board trustees called and said, "Stop, don't paint the building anymore." And so we went down and had this school board meeting, and it's because vibrant color is associated with the people, and beige brick is associated with success. And even in Mexico, during a presidential election, for example, it is not uncommon for the political parties to hand out, you'll see election signs painted on people's houses in Mexico. So handing out paint to paint your house is a political issue. I had a project, a community college project in South Texas, and there were brick buildings, but only half of the brick was exposed, and then each building within this new campus had its own color. And was all the way through design. The buildings were under construction. I went to a community college board meeting, and one of the trustees said, "I don't want to paint the buildings." And so we said, "Why?" And he said, "When I was growing up, if you were poor, you had secondhand brick, and so you painted over it. And this is first-class brick, and I want to expose it." How do you argue with that? And so I don't understand everything about it, but there are parts of that are in some cases things that we want to leave behind that are not assimilation. There are parts of it that are political, and there are parts of it that are socioeconomic. Yes, ma'am.
I want to